let's go ahead and get started. As we get started here today, just a little bit of guidance for you about how we're going to work through this session. So certainly we have some legislation on the radar for the business meeting later today that is a result of this study, but we also thought it was really important that we walk you through kind of where did all of this come from? Because I know for some of you, this is going to feel like it's a big study, but I hadn't heard about it before. And in part, that's probably because we've lost some of our opportunities over the course of the last 14 or 15 months to touch base with everybody in person by not having convention last year and some of those sorts of things. So we want to make sure that everybody understands where this is coming from and how we got to where we got. And then we'll certainly go through the specifics of the legislation as well. So to get us started, this really all came out of a membership survey in 2019, where we were asking members, so college presidents, ADs, FARs, and coaches, to help us understand how regular seasons were basically working. We were kind of on the heels or about to finish up working on a process with postseason formats. So we recognized in that discussion that while it's great to adjust our postseason, and we should do that as necessary, that regular seasons impact all of our student athletes and all of our programs. So we need to look at those as well. As we worked through the various concerns, you can see kind of the key items, and there were definitely trends coming out of the various constituent groups and the respondents here that we saw. So if you combine missed class time and academic performance, and then student experience and health and safety, all of those kind of going together, the three different constituent groups of CEOs, ADs, and FARs were all pretty unanimous in ranking those different topics pretty heavily here. Coaches were the only group that did not rank missed class time as a top concern, while it did rank as a top concern for some of our other groups. So you can see how this began to kind of shape some of our thinking. Another key item that we were hearing through the survey was asking about housing of student athletes and what kind of impact that has. So that was something that had kind of fed into some of the just initial commentary going into this survey, was that can be a burden. And so we were asking, help us understand, is that before the academic year, after the academic year, et cetera? And so if you look at the numbers for both, people saying it's before the academic year and after the academic year burdens, and those saying before the academic year, you can see that we end up with a majority of both our president and AD respondents saying that housing of student athletes before the academic year creates a significant burden. So that was a key kind of factor that stayed with us. And then as we try to go a little bit deeper and look at this on a sport by sport basis, recognizing that we may have different issues to address in some sports than others, we try to understand what were the various sports that were potentially causing the biggest concerns. You'll see that baseball was universally agreed to be a challenge. Softball and basketball were also nearly tied for second place by all respondents. And across all constituent groups, nearly half of our respondents said that these sports were problematic. Football is often an outlier as a sport in a general sense, but here for purposes of this survey and kind of the way that we were asking people to think holistically about their regular seasons, it was viewed as less of a problem than some other sports. I think that may have surprised some of us, but that may be the result of basically the fact that in football, we see one game per week and the season is constrained to one academic term. So that may be part of the way that people were responding to this here. Going into some of those top sports that were viewed as being more of a concern or more problematic, we then asked a little bit more specifically, what about it is problematic or it is a challenge? So as we look into these, we can certainly see trends here in the following. Missed class time and cost were universal top concerns in these various sports, and to a much greater extent than any of the others. So those are just some highlights. You can see for all of the information that we're going to share here today, you can see more data and kind of go deeper into it on the webpage that's on NAIA.org that is dedicated to basically this study and the various data and research that we have come across along the way. But sort of the key pieces coming out of that initial survey, we're saying, all right, we're hearing from members, we got to focus on these top three concerns of missed class time and academic performance, student athlete experience and wellness, and just costs overall. We're also hearing housing before the fall term. That was pretty clear that creates a significant burden, and that some sports deserve specific review and revision, but not necessarily all. So that was kind of our survey conclusions. And The Council of Presidents really was the one sort of charging us to say, we need to figure out a framework to begin to address these concerns at an association level. So that really put us on the path of creating this study. You'll note as we go through here that we really tried to use our governance structure to do this study. And by that, what I mean is we could have created just one task force and tried to represent all of these various issues. But we recognize that we have various groups already and various leaders kind of already identified in these respective areas who we could lean on their expertise and their perspective. So from the ADA and the CCA side, certainly those are very large groups and we needed to kind of narrow it down. So as you hear us reference a study group with what that is, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but that's a subset of our athletics directors and conference commissioners who are represented by their who are selected by their respective groups to represent them in studying this. We also leaned on the Council for Student Athletes to really help us dig into the student athlete health and wellness as well as experience side of things. And the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives to help us think about the academic success and missed class time side of things. So as we talked with all of these groups in the early days, we were really coming to these general, you can see these are obviously very shortened versions, but these were our general guiding principles. We need to find ways to reduce operational costs. We need to make sure that we are allowing for adequate time off, both physically and mentally, and that includes of the student athletes, the participants, certainly from the physically standpoint, but also our support staff as well. We need to minimize the missed class time and negative academic impact. We recognize those they don't always go hand in hand necessarily. Ensure a positive student athlete experience, looking at it holistically, and create more balance for our support staff. So I'm going to talk just a moment about the CFAR and the CSA involvement in this. As you've probably noticed, much of the legislation that we've been talking about throughout the course of this week doesn't necessarily get into things like missed class time and some of those specifics, but I want to touch on why that is and what were some of those conversations at the CFAR and the CSA level. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but I would ask as I go as well, we have some members of CFAR and CSA who are on the call with us today, and please feel free to chime in or catch anything that I may have missed. So as we talked with CFAR on missed class time and academic success, it was clear that missed class time was a clear focus early on, and we spent lots of time discussing how could we analyze these trends, how can we get data, how could we address those challenges once we get that data. But what we kept coming back to, conversation after conversation, was that ultimately the available solutions, things like maximum limits for missed class time or capping athletic activity hours per week, that those seemed to create as many problems as they attempted to solve. So before long, the focus of the group turned to looking at this a bit more holistically through the lens of academic success, recognizing that there may be some sports that do have missed class time, but doesn't seem to be an academic challenge, as an example. And that ultimately maybe just trying to find a one-size-fits-all approach to missed class time is missing the boat here, and that there's a different way to look at it. So as we looked at it more holistically, and as we listened to the responses of the students, it was clear that they were feeling the pressure with significant time demands in competing directions, often noting just how pulled they felt between athletic demands and academic demands, as well as potentially other obligations that they may have. We also recognize that different conferences and different sports have different challenges. And so again, one solution that works in one place may not work elsewhere. Some conferences have large geographic footprints, others have significant weather challenges. The reason that can matter for academic purposes is how we see those makeup games often sort of condensing into the end of the spring semester, right when students are kind of wrapping up the academic term and studying for finals and all of those sorts of things, a time when we would otherwise say maybe coursework needs to be prioritized. We recognize that some sports hardly ever miss class because they only compete on the weekends, maybe not quite as often. So all of those combined, we're really bringing CFAR to determine that NAIA regulation may not be the appropriate way to solve this, but the impact of athletics on academic performance absolutely does need to be an NAIA priority for all of us. I'm also going to reference the StudentAthlete Survey. There is sort of an executive summary in the materials to this session, and you can go into the full materials and kind of a sport by sport breakdown on that webpage that I mentioned earlier, and we'll get that in the chat here. But some of those top requests from student athletes, specifically talking about this pull and time demands and what could help them. We did ask student athletes if you could work with your athletic department to institute one change to help academic performance, what would that be? And the overwhelming theme centered around these competing time demands rather than any specific resource that they asked for. There was a strong desire, it was clear, a strong desire for flexibility, understanding, accessibility, and also accountability. That was coming from the student athletes as well. So they talked a lot about things of how do we schedule classes in coordination with athletic requirements. They were recognizing that the scheduling is a key challenge and that they needed help. They needed help from both their athletic leaders, so their coaches and administration, as well as their academic leaders. So whether it's their professors, whether it's things like priority scheduling, whether it's additional course offerings that give them a bit more flexibility in how they attend course, so whether that's online and those sorts of things, that was raised over and over. I mean, dozens and in some cases, hundreds of times, we were hearing these same sorts of themes coming through. There were also a lot of comments about we need coaches and faculty members who support us as student athletes holistically. We need them to understand that we want to be successful. We need our coaches to understand we want to be successful academically. We don't want to miss class all the time. We also need our professors and our faculty to understand that we also want to be successful athletically, and we are pulled in that direction too. So we need help and we need support from both angles, and we would really love to see those two groups working together. So to sum it up, from the CFAR side of things, they really came to the conclusion of this is probably not an NAIA regulation solution, but rather campus and conference-based solution. So what does that mean? How do we pursue that? From CFAR's perspective, we're recognizing that leaders have to be prioritized or have to be engaged in this conversation and prioritize this conversation and how they are having those campus and conference-based policy discussions and those sorts of things. So that means our academic leaders, our presidents, provosts, BPAAs, as well as our ADs and our commissioners when we're talking about things like scheduling and all of those sorts of things. How can you engage your academic leaders in those conversations to bring that perspective to bear, to see if there are ways that we can improve or adjust and essentially work together to create the end all be all best solution we can get for our student athletes. We need to find those workable solutions. So some of those types of ideas that we're coming up were as a campus or conference, maybe you consider things like limit the size of travel parties. I know that everybody talks about student athlete experience and that it's a great experience for students to travel and be with the team, and that is true, but it also creates in some cases additional missed class time and additional drain from an academic side that may not be entirely necessary. So are there ways to think about that? Can we provide additional academic resources? We had lots of requests saying, it'd be great if I could have Wi-Fi in the bus or in locker rooms or just ways to help me do my schoolwork when I'm on the road. Or if we could have proctors on occasion or additional tutors or whatever that looks like. And making sure that in the conference scheduling conversation, like I mentioned, we have both ADs and FARs represented. I'll move on to the CSA side of things and their involvement. There was a lot of work done by the CSA and the Athletic Trainers Association related to that postseason format discussion that I mentioned that really helped us understand things like adequate amount of rest and recovery time needed between competitions in a particular sport. So that was certainly useful as we got into this and thinking about calculations of sort of its practice and competition start dates and what does that trajectory look like over the course of the season and making sure those rest and recovery times were included. There's also some really good injury information that we were provided by the Athletic Trainers Association that helped play into all of this. I think one of the key things for me as well is that the Council for Student Athletes was really a driver in helping everyone to think about this from the holistic student athlete experience perspective and recognizing that goes beyond just athletics. So that there needs to be this focus on all of these competing time demands, and that certainly includes academics, but it's broader than that too. As the Student Athlete Survey shows, these excess competing time demands impact their athletic performance, their academic performance, their mental health, their ability to be involved in other activities or work. As we know, lots of our student athletes are working and employed to help pay their way through college. So we can't lose sight of those things by just thinking that as we talk about stuff like game limitations or practice dates, it's easy for us to think about it only in terms of athletics and students want to play, and they do, but that's not the only thing. They're not just athletes. They are student athletes who have a lot of things in their life beyond just athletics. The CSA does have interest in continuing to think about the length or the structure of the 24-week season, especially specific to the preseason. That was kind of a key point of conversation from the CSA, how that preseason is structured and conducted, and note that it may raise more health and wellness concerns at times than regular seasons. So this proposal, the legislative proposal that we have in front of us to deal with later today at the business meeting, is a step in the right direction from the CSA's perspective, but recognizing that we'd like to continue to monitor how such legislation, and certainly if it was to pass, could impact those current practices on campus, because that's something that we want to keep a close eye on from the CSA's perspective. I'm going to stop for just a moment in case, I know we have some of our CSA and CFAR leaders on the call, and I'd invite anybody to chime in if there's anything that I'm missing here as I was representing it on behalf of those two groups. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. So now I'm going to turn to our group of athletic director and conference commissioner leaders who have really kind of worked on the specific side related to structure and format. So that's the side that they were essentially charged with. How do we schedule all of these things and make it workable from an athletics logistics perspective? You can see on your screen those leaders, and certainly over the course of the 18 months or 2 years that this study has been ongoing, we've lost a couple of members, but this is the group who has also helped us to find the specifics of the legislation, as well as work with our coaches associations and appropriate constituent groups to get here. So these are those same guiding principles again, but I'm going to turn it over to Mike Daniels now to walk us through some of the specific research that we reviewed.
Sure. Thanks, Chesney. Yeah, in looking at these guiding principles, it was something that the committee always went back to. And I think that's important because when we've heard a lot of the conversation throughout this last, and I believe it's probably over 2 years now that we've talked about this, and we've talked about it over COVID times, we were charged by the COP for this study, and we wanted to make sure that we always went back to, are we meeting the guiding principles that they charged us with? You did see our team that was on there in the slide. I also want to make sure that we thank Chesney. Chesney was a great force for us in driving us and keeping us on task and making sure we're following these guiding principles. So Chesney, publicly thank you for all the work that you did. Our team also approached a strategy that we wanted to make sure that we were inclusive of all of our coaches' executive committees. We approached AD groups, commissioner groups, CFAR, student athletes, presidents, but we also hit our coaches to have the conversation. Oftentimes when you're talking about legislation, whether it be legislation like this or through the NAC, coaches sometimes feel like that they don't get a voice. They had a voice. They might not have agreed with some of the direction of this legislation, but they did have a voice, and each one of us had great conversations with them and trying to explain, okay, where's the give and take here? If we do make some changes, what can you be comfortable with? What do we do now? And now I'm going to go into the data that kind of shows of, well, what is reality? The first slide, I think, is talking about contest limits and where we sit right now. And we put this slide up to comparing ourselves where Division II and Division III is. Not that we want to be like the NCAA. That's not the case at all. It's really to see what is the data, where are we? And to make sure that when we're making these adjustments, if there are adjustments to be made, that we're not falling short of what our coaches are recruiting against. And a lot of times our coaches recruit against Division IIs and Division IIIs. So when they say, well, Division II has 50 contests in baseball, and we came out with a study that says we're going to play 45 games. Well, there's no way that our NAIA baseball coaches would get behind that whatsoever. They might not be behind the 50 games either, but we want to at least compare ourselves to those that were recruiting students. So you can see about 3 different areas there that the NAIA is relatively above where Division II and Division III are. Now, reality. A lot of times when we look at those limits that we just saw that the NAIA has, how many are actually reaching those limits? And this chart shows, and this is just 3 examples. We did look at all sports. So there's soccer, volleyball studies on here as well. but these three sports in particular, did we reach, again, going back to baseball, the 55 game limit? 23% of our schools did. Now, I will say that this study, when we pulled it from DAC stats as well, is relative to postseason too. So your limit is through your regular season competition, not through the postseason. This reflects postseason number of games. So it's a little off per se, but you could see only 23% in baseball is hitting that. 54% in football, and then 13% in softball. And that is pretty comparative, that you can look and see, and part of it, and we'll take baseball and softball again, and you could even say golf, because I know there's a friendly amendment that we'll talk about later for golf, is that weather does play a factor for northern schools for sure. If there's snow on the ground, you're not playing baseball and softball games, and you're not getting on golf courses. They're closed. So there is some relative to, you can't get that number of games in. My conference out in the GSAC, the West Coast, we can play that number because we have great weather. But other parts in the country, we have to factor in as well. So this is just part of the reality of, okay, are our schools getting those number of games in? That leads to the next piece, and we're going to look at this from how the schedule creep, and we've called that, I think it's now called regular season formats, but it started as schedule creep, the name of this committee. And this is really was alarming for us when we did this study. And some of this isn't even on there. There was a team or a school that played 10 games in a single day in the month of February. 10 games. And that was crazy. But let's look at this. There are 6 games, 303 instances of that, 5 games, 495, and then 4 games, there's 2,100 instances, over 2,100 instances that this is occurring. We often think of our seasons as there's a fall season, a winter season, and a spring season, but really that's not the case. It's a big overlap. And I think this goes to show that this multiple number of games that your institution is hosting or competing in is happening quite often. Moving to the next slide. Yes, that's the next part is our student-athlete survey. So again, we did want to approach every group with this study. And this, there was over 1,800 student athletes that looked and filled out this survey. And I think that, from a sample size, that's a small percentage, but you can see that the numbers there of why they choose a certain institution, the number of games played is towards the bottom of the list. And I'm looking at the final point on there that they choose it by academic reputation, athletic reputation, playing time, athletic aid for sure. But the number of games played is a low factor in their decision to join our schools. And oftentimes I think we hear from our coaches that, if we don't get to the number of games or our season isn't as long as possible, that we're going to lose on the recruiting aspect. And that's just not the case when you talk to the student athletes. And again, this probably happens a lot, that if you talk to the coaches about the student athlete response, it's different than you actually approach the student athletes themselves. Because oftentimes the student athlete is going to give a coach what they want to hear. And then now, again, we've moved in this organization with our SACs, and a lot of conferences have SACs. And so there's a direct response that we can get from those student athletes that's a safe place. We've talked about that a lot in this convention through the RISE and different committees that are happening. And I think that's important, to get a direct response from the student athletes of what is really important to them. And Chesney hit it a little bit earlier, what the key factors are for them. And we have to think about this from a big holistic approach.
Okay, we'll move on here in just a second. I'm looking at a question in the chat, Mike, on the number of games per day. The question was, is that for the sports we just showed, football, baseball, softball, or does it include other sports? And that does include other sports as well. So we just pulled out football, baseball, and softball on that one slide as an example of 3 sports and how many games they played throughout the course of the season. But that next slide that had discussed number of games on a particular day did include additional sports.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I failed to mention that I think we all know that our biggest crossover times is the month of February and the month of October. And we had a study that 17% of our competitions are taking place in the month of February. So yeah, those are the two biggest impact, and crossover sports affect that as well: a basketball, a wrestling, a golf, a tennis. But yeah, that study was all sports, not just those three we showed.
Okay, so we're going to move on in this grid, and it might be if it's difficult for you to view this on your screen, because I know that some of this text does get small, trying to get it all on the screen. There is an attachment, an icon to this session on the convention platform where you can open that icon and get several materials related to the session, but including this grid. And what this shows basically represents the legislation that we've been talking about throughout the course of this week, just kind of in one easily viewable place, both comparing the current practice to the proposed rule. So now we're just going to go through it and talk a little bit more specifically about how we got to where we got for all of these various changes. So I'm first going to turn to Eric Ward to talk to us about some of the fall sports and those conversations.
Thanks, Chesney. I also want to mention Ashley Wallachow was also part of the, he and I are the two remaining members on the task force that worked on the fall piece of this puzzle. And so I want to encourage Ashley to jump in with any comments he might have whenever he feels like it. When we looked at fall, we go back to some of the data and some of the information that was collected from presidents, ADs, coaches, etc. One of the things that we were aware of, and one of our guiding principles had to do with helping to reduce cost. And a big part of that cost is the preseason period of time in August, when you bring students back on campus prior to dorms being open and available, or cafeterias being open, and so there's considerable cost in terms of housing, feeding athletes. I think we saw 60%, nearly 60% of our presidents express concern about that pre-academic calendar year and post-academic calendar year, which is basically August and May. August is the one piece that we could control. May is much more difficult to control because keeping students on campus after final exams and graduation is primarily due to postseason competition to national championship participation, which is much more difficult to control. So we look primarily at trying to start the fall season a little bit later, setting a start date so that teams weren't coming in quite as early, setting practice start dates so that there was an opportunity for institutions to realize some savings on those housing and meal costs with bringing student athletes. Obviously, if you have football, this is a much bigger challenge for schools with football than those without football, but for everybody with volleyball, soccer, they're bringing student athletes in on August 1st or around August 1st, and competing from sometime in the middle of August, so the third or fourth week of August. Obviously, that's a big expense. I know one of the schools in the Mid-South Conference that has football budgets about $75,000 just to house and feed their football team, bringing them in on August 1 prior to their first game. So a big expense, and that's an area we felt like we could control. So we tried to focus on that. That's why we decided to set start dates, and practice start dates and competition start dates to try to help alleviate some of that. Now, there's been a lot of questions and a lot of comments over the last several days about the contest limits and the start dates piece being combined into one piece of legislation. As we've worked through this for the last 18 to 24 months, really those two things in our minds, the members of the task force, those two things are linked together, and doing one without doing the other in a lot of cases just didn't make sense. So that's why in some cases you'll see a slight reduction in the number of contests, and that primarily had to do with maybe shortening the length of the season by a week or so, sometimes as much as 10 days, with a little bit later start date, and trying to, for instance, volleyball, trying to get 28 dates in with a week less of the season. All we're doing is compounding some of the challenges that our student athletes are experiencing with overcrowding their schedules and the mental health aspect of trying to manage their athletic and academic demand. So as we went through, we felt cross country was of minimal impact in that early bringing student athletes back on campus early. Football, soccer, and volleyball were a bigger concern in terms of cost, and so that's where we focused on trying to set realistic start dates that would help minimize those early housing and meal costs, bringing student athletes back.
And it seemed that volleyball was quickly becoming the growing elephant in the room, to be honest.
Disney, do you want to take questions at the end of each one of these seasons?
Yep, let's do that. And I was just checking them there. There was a question in the chat related to both volleyball and soccer and why they have been adjusted through a friendly amendment to now be the third Thursday in August. And I think Mike was just responding there to everyone that for soccer and volleyball, that friendly amendment was made to include some preseason tournament play that is very common in both of those sports and often happens prior to the start of conference play. And it could also help reduce missed class time as well. So if there's anything, Eric or Ashley, that you guys want to add to that piece about the friendly amendment.
Other than Eric and I pulled our hair out going back and forth and around on those start dates, there was a lot of discussion. And even when Stan Wagner was involved, a lot of discussion on that start date. And feedback helped us get to and from and back and forth. And this is kind of where we ended up settling when it was all said and done. But this was probably, and Eric might correct me, but I think this was probably the biggest point of consternation with, at least with us, is trying to find out what the sweet spot for those start dates.
Yeah, we did get quite a bit of feedback from the coaches and from some conference commissioners who have rather robust conference schedules. And many of them are starting conference play right after Labor Day. So their window of opportunity to play non-conference, particularly tournaments prior to starting their conference schedule, was a really narrow window with that fourth Thursday. And so this is an example that Mike was talking about where we were actually listening. We were listening to people, we were taking feedback, and then we were trying to make realistic adjustments where we felt like it was appropriate and where we felt like we could. And with soccer and volleyball, we felt like giving an additional week prior to the start of the academic semester would help alleviate some of the pressures that were being communicated to us by those different groups.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions related to fall for this moment. Drew, I'm going to turn to you to walk us through some of the winter sport thought process.
Thanks, Jenny. And I would invite you, Mike, to kick in here. You were on the winter subcommittee for basketball. We looked at the NCAA, and one of the problems with basketball in the NCAA is that they have a set start date of October 15th, but then their practice, but then their first game date is variable, the second Friday in November. So, if you look at the 2019-20 basketball season, they would have had 3 weeks to prepare for that first game. So we didn't want to use that model. So we went with a model that said, hey, the first permissible game is that last weekend in October. And then if November 1st falls anytime that weekend, then you could start that weekend. So we took that date and worked 5 weeks back. Now, Lance, you asked the question a few minutes ago about limiting the excitement of teams coming back to start working with their team. They could still do that before the 5 weeks, just without a coach. So the practice, the definition of practice is still in place. They could also have individual sessions with their coach. But what we found is that there's some some, and I would say, more than some, it's more than a handful of schools that are, first week of classes, they're counting their 24 weeks, excuse me, and starting then. And we just felt like that's inappropriate. I mean, you look at the student athlete data and they don't want that. And so, we thought that 5 weeks was a reasonable runway to get ready for the season, when you consider you still can do that prep before that 5 week period. Another issue, with basketball is that when we reduce the number of games, Mike and I met with the executive committee for both men's and women's basketball, and particularly the men. Their first reaction to this was, no, we don't want a reduction in games. But as we talked and as they started talking amongst themselves and thinking about it, they thought, man, this would actually be pretty good. And they actually suggested it that particular day. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. They suggested as low as 26, but we landed on 28. One of the things that was attractive to them is, and many of you on this call will understand this, is that the Raiders will look at a team in basketball that plays 28 games out of the 30 and go, you didn't play 30 games. We're not going to rate you higher because of that. And I think they liked the fact that, you could play less games and it would be a pretty much more even across the board as to the bar that was set for games. They did not feel it was cheating the student athlete experience. And, I would say, Mike, we were surprised at the positive reaction to it. We did not expect that going into the call. So I'm going to turn to wrestling. Wrestling, as many of you know, is a psychologically, physically, emotionally grueling sport. When you're looking at making weight day after day, tournament after tournament, it can get very difficult for a wrestler. So we looked at that, and we looked at the amount of training and competition required, and really felt like it was reasonable to drop the game limit and to set those parameters on wrestling. So, that's the winter sports. Mike, did I miss anything there?
No, not at all, Drew. I think, I'll just echo when talking with the basketball executive committees, that they were very open to this. And I think the key for them, at least the executive committee, was being all on the same playing field. So when you talk about that comparison of 30 to 28 and you didn't reach that, 30, that was very, very true. In this way, they felt, hey, if we're all on the same playing field, then that's good. The other thing too that we talked about when it was, and it was all sports, but it was at least in the winter on basketball is, and Lance approached, the excitement of coming onto campus for the student athlete and wanting to get started right away. What we had heard is that students want to get acclimated to the new year first. And let's take that first couple of weeks to get ready for the academic side of things and then move into the practice side of things. So, I mean, that doesn't occur to the fall sports because they're already moving in, but the rest of them that are just arriving on campus with the rest of the student population, they want to get acclimated to the academic side first. And so that helped influence of kind of when we put those start dates.
Any questions on winter?
We're getting some questions in the chat that we've been responding to, but just to call it out for everyone, it relates to scrimmages and exhibitions. So this is a little hard to see just in the grid that's in front of you here, but our existing regulations where we talk about a contest regulation, obviously we don't really have start dates in the same way, but we're talking about the games. Like I'm going to take basketball as an example. We're talking about basketball games. So the first basketball game you could play would be the last Thursday in October. You could play a basketball scrimmage or an exhibition prior to that last Thursday in October. Basically, it would have to fall within that 35-day sort of practice window that you could play prior to that last Thursday. I shouldn't say it would have to. It could fall within that 35-day window, or it could come after. You could play your first game and then play a scrimmage a week later. So scrimmages and exhibitions are more flexible and fluid. I think that's it over here at the moment related to.
Did you, this is Troy Plummer from Grandview. Did you guys talk to all of the coaching committees in a similar fashion that you did with basketball and got similar feedback that they're good with reducing the game limits?
I'll take that one. We did reach out to, I think we reached out to every committee that we made a change. There are some sports that we didn't make changes to, and we might not have reached out to those, but every change that was made, we did talk to the executive committee, and no, they were not all on board of reducing. I mean, I specifically talked to the baseball guys and the men's soccer guys and basketball, you know, with my winter stuff, but I had a relationship with those for baseball and I know we'll talk about that soon. I think Darren Wilson talked with those guys too. They were not in favor of a reduction, but at least we had the conversation as to why we're looking at it. They had some other suggestions for sure. Wrestling, I know wrestling, there was a proposal to increase their numbers that has been withdrawn at this convention. And so I don't know if they come around to accepting this piece of legislation if it passes. I'm not sure, but I knew that they were going the opposite way, the wrestling guys.
And I'll just add on to that piece, Mike, just while it's up about wrestling. I think the reason, my understanding from their leadership group is the reason they were actually proposing more dates in wrestling wasn't necessarily because they felt like they had to have more dates. It actually was more about how those dates impacted an individual's wrestler's eligibility and whether he was charged a season of competition or not. So basically they wanted to give a wrestler sort of more runway before he hit that 20% mark. So they were just trying to increase the number of dates to get every wrestler at least one more date before he'd be charged a season. So they withdrew it, kind of recognizing that it kind of flies in the face of what this is trying to do. And so we're going to sort of regroup to determine if there's another way to kind of come at what they were thinking about, which is really more about individual student eligibility. But I'll turn back to the committee if there's any other comments on the Coaches Association part.
If I could just make one comment, I'm not on the committee, so I may be stepping in the wrong place. My name is Mark Smoller. I'm the athletic director at Mid-America in Oklahoma City. Specifically to the one piece of this, as it relates to the ratings, I would just make the comment that especially now with the National Tournament Selection Committee process and it being more widespread, our ratings and the top 25 poll play very little impact into the selection of teams and the seeding of teams in the national tournament. And so if we have committees where a team is going to be judged because they played 28 instead of 30, then we probably need to rethink the committee members. My hope would be that the people on the committee are looking at the full body of work. And if that's 28 games or that's 29 games, it should not play any impact into that. And I guess I feel like now more than ever, our national poll plays less of a role in that, which I would argue just because the necessary ratings process is a good thing. So I would just say that specifically on that note.
Yeah, Marcus, I think, we're in a transition with that. I was at the beginning of that selection committee process as well and sat on the baseball selection committee. They were the first to launch. And I think with the other sports going in that direction now, it's still that transition for coaches and for raters to know that what you said is exactly right. The ratings is secondary criteria. Primary is a lot of other factors, and really the strength of schedule and your arc ranking and the people that are talking about this throughout the season, those national committee members and those ARC committee members are really the ones making the decision. And the three selection committees I've been on to launch this, none of them talk about the number of games. It's quality of opponents. And I don't want to go down that road too much, but you're exactly right that it's quality of your competition, not the number of games. That's the deciding factor in those selection committee rooms.
Okay, we had a question in the chat that might actually be a good segue into talking about our spring sports. And I think Corey was going to walk us through some of the spring sports. And Corey, I'll go ahead and read the question and you can address it sort of as you go here. The question relates to why would we limit game dates if most institutions are already limiting their own number of games played. So based on probably our earlier research that we showed where baseball and softball, as an example, are not playing the maximum already. And then we shouldn't limit a school that wants to play 30 basketball games because another school doesn't think their team should play 30 games. Essentially, why can't this just be institutional? Why do we need to address it? So Corey, I'll look to you to start to get us into spring.
All right. Thanks, Chesney. Good morning, everyone. I know we're zoomed out by this point, so bear with us here. We're getting there. Good question. Fair question as well. If you were on the caucus yesterday, I think it goes back to maybe a comment I made there about individual conferences maybe looking at restrictions and changes like this and finding out that it's really hard to go alone into that situation. And I think that that's why this committee brought a lot of facets of the NAIA together to look at the whole. I think the inclusion and addition of our student athletes over the last couple of years with the student athlete councils and so on has maybe brought to the forefront some of their thoughts and ideas when it comes to this. And I think when you look at that data, I think that reductions it may not hit you, like a hammer, but I think it comes out of there that the limits are warranted. And I think that that's where the genesis again of this whole committee came from, at the guidance of the Council of Presidents. So institutional autonomy has been a big part of the NAIA, grassroots, call it what you want. But I think that conferences over the years have found really hard to go alone into this. And this would be a collective approach. And that leads me into spring a little bit, which is a tough one because of weather, particularly when it comes to baseball and softball with our diversity of South versus North. And I think we've all, maybe it's more of a northern thing, I don't know, but we've all seen that baseball game on January 10 and gone, oh my, they're playing a baseball game on January 10. And yeah, you can. In certain parts of the country, we understand that, but it's also a very long season. And I wanted to kind of touch on a couple of points before I come back to that. I think from a committee perspective is we really spent a lot of time talking about the 24-week rule. And whether or not just adjusting the 24-week rule would be something that maybe could address this grid that you're seeing here. And I think we landed on it doesn't maybe do that per se. And I think we had to dive into individual sports respectively. So that's why we didn't come out with like a 22-week rule as a blanket, rather just keeping it at 24, because there is still time in the schedule in the academic calendar for that. Couple things on the spring level, and I want to recognize Reagan Rossi at College of Idaho and Darren Wilson at Georgia Gwinnett, who were on this group with me. We may have been the committee that lost one as well with the AD from Simpson, but softball kind of pops off at you a little bit because it looks like we're making this major reduction. And that's mainly because of how legislation fell last year, is that this was the first year of the games approach instead of the dates approach for softball. So it looks like this huge change, but in reality, it kind of falls back into line with baseball. So I just wanted to point that out as a point of clarification. We did not touch men's volleyball because of it being a new sport, but I do want to highlight the yellow boxes about the September 1, and that was a part of the friendly amendment number 1. And there was some perception out there when we said earlier you could go August 1 on those sports that it didn't look great to have a sport starting August 1 in men's volleyball, as an example, when we're telling women's volleyball, you can't start on August 1. And that was never the intention of the group. That was a clarification that needed to come out. And I think that's why friendly amendment number 1 came to be, and rightly so, and was supported by this group. So I wanted to point out that. There is friendly amendment number 2. It hasn't maybe been discussed in great detail, and it does have to do with discussions throughout this convention, and that was about golf. And we met as a committee last night, and what we're saying is we hear you. We think that it is reasonable to request that golf could go to the 4th Thursday of August for their start. Is there impact? Yes. Is it a large impact? Not necessarily. So that is actually friendly amendment number 2. So put the two together. Really, they're kind of the same thing, but they happened at different times. baseball, softball have been the ones that probably drove getting this discussion to the table. Let's be very honest with it. And probably to a certain extent, the early coming in of fall sports, those things combined together. But we feel like the calibration of going late January with that Thursday date seemed to be the sweet spot for us as we looked at it. And we felt like that would still give everybody a pretty good opportunity to have a robust season. I think when you look at the data that Mike presented earlier, that maybe not everybody's getting to those games anyway, I think that gives you more than adequate time to have a meaningful experience for your student athletes. Those were really my comments, and I will turn to Reagan or Darren as part of the spring group if they have any questions, and then we can go to the chat box as well, Chesney.
No, I think you covered it, Corey. Thanks.
There's a question in the chat box about moving postseason into June. I don't think that that's where the Council of Presidents is at right now. I think that the Council of Presidents, and I'm not a COP member, but I have sat in that meeting. I think that right now with where baseball and track and field are, which is right now, so the date today, that's about as late as I think the NAIA COP wants to go. Chesney would maybe have a better sense on that from the national office, but that really moves us out into coverage issues. And I think that's another thing that maybe hasn't come out of this discussion is our support staffs. COVID exposed that a lot, that we ask a lot of people, and the groups, SIDs, ATCs, assistant athletic directors, maybe coaches in their off season. And we're trying to bring it back to center a little bit and recognize that we are the NAIA and we have to be really cognizant of our resources. So I wanted to mention that as well.
Corey, I would agree with you. I think, I don't know this from the Council of Presidents perspective, but I think as we're seeing, there seems to be a trend of schools ending spring academic terms a little bit earlier, that then extending postseason later just would increase that burden of keeping those teams around. Now, maybe because it's not everybody, it's just those that are in postseason. Maybe it's not quite as large a burden as we currently are seeing in the fall, but I think there'd be hesitancy there. We've got about 5 more minutes. So if you have any final questions or anything like that, go ahead and put them in the chat. I've got one here for anybody on the study group for any of the seasons. Any concern that this will make scheduling more difficult for geographic outliers and or schools that are traditionally competitive? Schools will have maybe less flexibility or freedom to schedule non-conference games.
Well, this is Mike. I think I can take that as a geographic outlier. My conference, it's already difficult for us in the CalPAC. My brother Don Ott. It's tough for us to play anybody in kind of the rest of the NAIA. I probably include the Cascade in there and maybe even the Frontier. It's difficult already to schedule. It actually probably, I would say it helps a little bit because it gives it more of an even playing field and less number of games that we have to go and try to chase or pay for. So it's probably going to reduce costs a little bit, at least for the outliers. Again, GSAC, CalPAC, Cascade.
Anything to add to that? Anybody else from the study group? I'm scrolling through other comments in the chat here. I think just go ahead.
Chesney, I think it's probably a misnomer that we're ever going to eliminate that quote unquote crossover season. I think that's just the reality of who we are. But hopefully some of these steps are steps in the right direction. I think the contest limitations may help that to a certain extent. And again, that earliness of maybe not extending that runway of the crossover as long as it can get in some situations. And our committee, I think, fully realizes that this is not what every school does. But again, going back to the collective NAIA and looking at our student athletes' health and well-being, and I think cost containment. I think we have to mention cost containment again, especially coming out of COVID. That I think that this was a wise and prudent discussion for the NAIA to have at this time. So just wanted to share those thoughts.
Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions. So at that time, I think we'll wrap up. I want to say a big thank you to all of the study group. This was a lot of work, and certainly I think the study group, I gave them multiple opportunities throughout the course of the last year to say, we can slow this down a little bit. We all have other things to be dealing with. And I think they felt like to Corey's last point there, that this is a really important conversation to be having, and it's an association. So sort of took it upon themselves to make sure that we were continuing to push forward and address the concerns and try to identify the solutions. So I would say a big thank you to the study group. And I would remind everybody that your opportunity to sort of voice your opinion on this study and these proposals will come later today at the business meeting. So with that, thank you everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you later today.